Good morning. My name is Janet Robledo and I'm your Conservation Coordinator with East Valley Water District. Thank you for joining us today at our virtual workshops, one of many. We hope that you continue to join us. All of our workshops will be virtual through Facebook Live. We, as well as I am very sad that you can't join us in person, but we know that day will come soon. In the meantime, I want to share some important information for today's workshop. If you have your SoCal Yard Transformation book, go ahead and grab it. We're going to be referencing it today. And if you don't, that is not a problem. Visit eastvalley.org, visit the conservation page, and then you'll have access to this book so that you can follow along as well. I also want to share with you that the district offers 6 rebate programs to help you in your conservation efforts as you make those changes in your home and outdoors to save water. I also want to let you know about a great opportunity. How many of you have participated in our weather-based irrigation controller direct installation program? I'm sure I can see many hands out there raising them, but if you're not one of those, that's not a problem at all. You still have the opportunity to save water and participate in this program. For more information, visit eastvalley.org/conservation to learn how you can participate in our free program that is no cost to you that will help you start saving water. Well, now I want to go ahead and introduce you to Isabel, who is with Inland Empire Waterkeeper, and who's going to share all this important information on how we can, as a family, have fun out there in our garden. Thanks for joining us, and stick around till the very end to learn about raffle opportunities and upcoming workshops. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Isabel Hernandez, and I'm with Inland Empire Waterkeeper. Today's presentation is going to be on family-friendly gardening. And the first thing we're going to be talking about today is safety in the garden. We always want to make sure safety is a priority, and we're going to be talking about things that you need to make sure that you are conscious and aware of, especially around children. One thing that I always recommend for all gardeners are garden gloves. Other items such as knee pads, whether they're for the floor or actually strapped on your knees, they can be a lifesaver when you're doing a lot of work. Another thing is safety glasses. Safety glasses will always come in handy, especially when you are pruning or trimming things that will be protruding towards you. You always want to protect your eyes. You also want to wear attire that is going to protect you, such as long sleeves and closed shoes. So sandals and flip-flops are really not recommended. One thing that I also recommend is a garden stool. For those of you that might have back issues or knee issues, it will be a lifesaver, especially when you're doing your garden at ground level and you just are trying to save your back. Another thing that you might want to consider is, of course, the hazards of the garden. One of the things that you want to make sure is that the power tools and the sharp tools, the long-handled tools, are something that you may want to steer away from, especially small children. Power tools, of course, you want to make sure that are being handled appropriately and are always mindful of their whereabouts, especially around small kids. I would definitely not recommend any kind of power tools around a group of children, so I suggest that you reconsider those situations. Sharp tools, of course, based on the children's maturity and, of course, on the number of children, you might want to also consider. One more thing is long-handled tools. They may not be sharp, they may not have power, but if they're left in the ground, they can definitely hurt someone if they are not properly put in a place where the kids will not step on them or injure themselves with them. So keep those safety issues in mind. Another thing, of course, is handling chemicals. Many times chemicals are required for the power tools or for the garden itself. Be mindful of inhaling them or putting them, making contact with them, and be always aware of those chemicals, especially around the children, and of course fuels as well. Another thing we're going to be talking about is garden activities. Of course, with the children wanting to be outdoors and wanting to do things, and being a little more active, we want to make recommendations that are going to be family friendly. One thing that we do suggest is that children start up their seeds. They can use a marker to identify their seed. They can use a chopstick and a ruler to identify how deep to push the seed into the soil. They can also do things around the house, such as scavenger on things that they can recycle to use, always for different kinds of potting containers. They can use baskets or even drawers that might be not used anymore. Of course, they can use bins if you drill drainage holes in them. And then you can have them use them as activities with stickers and paints and just things that will keep them entertained. Now, as far as entertaining children, usually their attention span will be about half an hour, and they may need some pause or some breaks between. A possible snack would be a good way of putting a nice pause to it. And be mindful that not everything that they do is going to be perfect. These stakes that they might be decorating might not be spelled correctly or may not be perfect at all. But of course, this is just an activity to keep the children involved and integrated into the garden activities. One thing that we do also want to be mindful of is for those older kids that are easy to be distracted and they can keep track of things. You can use math, such as with a calendar. You can have them measure heights. You can have them also measure water, and of course even count the number of vegetables or flowers that are growing. You can have them read the temperature and always create a chart in that calendar. So there's a lot of activities, especially on the internet, on Pinterest, on many sites that you can find, but for the most part, you can overwhelm your kids. And if things don't look perfect, it's okay, because this is just going to be a memory. And as this happens to be an example of one of my kids' doings, not necessarily staying in the line, not necessarily coloring it perfect. It's still their memory, their craft, and time spent bonding. So those are activities you can do. You can do things also like scarecrows. Create them from your own recyclable clothing, clothes that no longer fit your children, or you can do birdhouses, wind chimes. You can do a photo journal of the whole garden experience. Of course, many families do social media and they share. That's a perfect way of just sharing a new passion and a found activity to do at home. One thing that I want to make sure that all gardeners do is that they walk away with the fundamental basics of gardening. As parents, we all want to know exactly what we're doing, especially when our kids are mindful of all the things that we're doing. So the first thing that we want to talk about is our soil, because that's exactly what we're doing. We're working with the soil in the garden. So here's an example of a mason jar that you can use. You can fill it halfway with your native soil from your garden. The other half is going to be regular tap water, and you're going to leave about an inch just so that it has air. When you mix it, you shake it, and by the next day, it'll have settled. You will be able to determine, based on how it settles, what kind of soil you have. So be sure to check that out. It's a great activity to have your kids do. You don't have to buy the mason jars. You can use maybe some that you have at home already. As long as they're visible and clear, you should be able to use them. So anything from the jams and preservatives to the mayonnaise jars can be just as well used. And once you determine what kind of soil you have, after it settles, the soil on itself will separate. The sand will be on the bottom and the clay will be on top. And you will see a division that will separate it, and that is what is called loam or silt. That's really the perfect soil. So if you happen to have more sandy soil, you may need to make amendments to your native soil to ensure it gets to that middle point. If you have clay, there's also a remedy for that so that it also becomes that loamy soil that we all seek for as gardeners. One thing that you can do is look on page 29 of your SoCal Transformation Yard Book, and you can get more information on the percentage, how to do it, and also get more testing resources if you seek to go above and beyond a simple testing kit like this. Now, the reasons you want to test your soil, of course, is because it also determines the amount of water that it's going to absorb. Sandy soil will absorb a lot more water, and it'll absorb it a lot deeper than clay soil. Clay will always be the water will always stay on the surface and will be very shallow. So it is an issue that you want to be able to resolve with your soils, but if you don't, you also need to make the proper adjustments with either drip irrigation or your regular irrigating system. Now, everybody wants to know what kind of soil to use on their vegetables. And I am going to tell you that it does depend. If you are going to put it in a container, such as this, or as the one you see in front of me, you are going to need potting mix. There you're going to find at the box stores potting soil. Remember, it's a potting mix. And the reason you need this is because it's a perfect blend, perfectly pH balanced, and the appropriate amount of material that will sustain it as it's restricted from any other source of nutrients. So using the potting mix on a container is the ideal soil to use. Now, if you're going to use in your garden, in ground, or on a planter soil, you will need organic compost with amended soil. Those two items will ensure that your native soil is going to be properly amended so that your edibles grow and thrive perfectly throughout the season. Now, we're going to talk about the 11 kid-friendly crops. These crops are perfect because we've considered the time of length for them to grow, the fact that they grow very easily and don't have a lot of diseases or pests, and of course they seem to be more on the foolproof side. Not always necessarily, but we're going to be talking about situations when that doesn't happen. So let's talk about those. Sunflowers, cherry tomatoes, snow peas, lettuce, carrots, radishes, bush beans, zucchinis, strawberries, pumpkins, and the flower nasturtium. The reason I've included nasturtium is because it's got a lot of punch in color, and it is an edible flower. So those are always perfect. Great backdrops to take pictures with your kids because they have this beautiful orange, multicolor, different orange yellows, and they're great for pictures, and they really put in a punch on decorating a meal. So those are your 11 kid-friendly crops. I definitely recommend that you consider them. But when you do, there's a few questions that you do need to ask yourself. And all gardeners need to know the answer to the next 5 questions to ensure that their plants thrive and do very well in their garden. The first question, of course, is going to be, how much does this plant grow? Believe it or not, you may go to the home box store and come home with a 6-pack of tomatoes. When you pull them out of the container, they'll be about 2 by 2 inches wide. But these particular tomatoes, especially depending on the variety, may grow as wide as 3 feet and 3.5 to 4 feet in height. Considering that they come in a 6-pack, many people are misguided by not knowing how much they grow. So you want to make sure you do know what the full maturity space is so that you can provide it to your plants. Whether it's edibles or even ornamentals, make sure you know that. Another thing, of course, is lighting. The lighting is crucial for the plant. If it is going to be an edible that is going to set fruit, more than likely it will need partial to full sun. Now you have a set of lettuce right here, and this lettuce, of course, is not going to set fruit, but it is going to require plenty of shade. So those are things that you want to be conscious about and very aware of. And you do need to understand that of any plant that you choose to integrate into your garden. The next question is the one we just recently talked about. It's the soil. What kind of soil does your garden need? We talked about the vegetables, and they do need a lot of compost because they are heavy feeders. And that's the reason we made the suggestion of the organic manures, the composting, and of course the amended soils. What you need to understand is that all plants do vary, so do not go under the assumption that they all fall under the same category. Please do your homework. The next one, of course, is how much to water. Lettuces may require a lot more water than other plants, and other plants may require a lot less. You need to know exactly the needs of your plants. If you don't, you will probably find out that more than likely people tend to overwater and drown their plants to death. So be mindful of the amount of water it requires because it is very important. Now, understanding those 4 questions and knowing those answers to every plant that you introduce to your garden will give you the edge of providing the perfect environment for your plants to thrive. But the final question is going to just give you a little more of an edge, which is what kind of pest and disease is this plant susceptible to? You want to understand beforehand what kind of pests your plants may fall victim to. You want to also understand what kind of diseases are very common to the plants you bring in. And so when you do your garden walk-arounds and you monitor your garden and your plants, you always want to be mindful of those things to always catch them early. More than likely, on a healthy plant, you will find that they do not fall victim to pest or disease. Although there are circumstances that may alter those situations with maybe a neighboring yard that has neglected landscaping and a lot of issues with their plants and pests, they may just be introduced to your garden by just being in close proximity. But like I said, these 5 questions will ensure that if you answer them, know exactly what your plant's needs are and provide it to them, you will have a very healthy garden. Now let's get ready for some planting gardening tips. One of the things that I'm going to be teaching you now is some of the fundamental basics of gardening tips that you're going to need to get this gardening activity started. For one thing, when you do plant any plants, you never want to introduce them with dry soil. You want to make sure that you submerge them and that you let it drain before you put it into the soil itself. That will avoid air pockets that will potentially cause your plant to wilt or even die. So be mindful of that. Another thing, of course, is that you want to water the planting hole. You want to fill it, you want it to drain so that the native soil absorbs that water and it doesn't wick it out of the plant you introduce. And another thing, of course, with air pockets is that you want to temper the soil when you are planting your plant. You want to remove all the air out of it, and you want to make sure that the soil properly settles to ensure that there aren't any air pockets trapped among the soil itself. And of course, another one is that you do not want to plant any plants in the middle of a hot day. You want to wait until a late afternoon or an early morning, a nice cool early morning to do so. And this will just ensure that your plant does not become stressed. Now, for those of you that might be doing edibles, such as lettuces like you see here, you might be doing rows of them. And one thing that I do want you to be, I want to recommend to you if you're going to grow many, is that you stagger them. What I mean by that is that you plant a row 1 week, maybe wait 2 weeks later and plant another, and continue to do so up to 4 to 6 weeks. And as your crop is ready to harvest, you harvest your first week's crop, and then you have time being able to eat that crop first to then obviously use the second week, third week, and fourth week without having a huge bumper crop. So those just a little tip for those of you that are going to have edibles that you want to just stagnate on timing. Now, another thing is that every 2 years you do need to rotate your crops from the location that you install it. The reason for it is because those plants will deplete the soil of many nutrients. And as you rotate them, all plants do take nutrients, but they all vary depending on the plant. So rotation is very crucial, very important to ensure you have a thriving garden. Another thing we're going to be talking about is fertilizers. When you apply fertilizer, you want to make sure you never apply it to dry soil. So you always want to make sure that the soil is moist. The best time to add the fertilizer is going to be from spring to autumn. And you do not want to apply any fertilizer on the plant itself or on the stem, particularly right on it. The reason for it is that most of the time fertilizers can burn those plants, and you want to make sure you don't do that. People always ask, what is the best fertilizer? And we always recommend organic fertilizers first. Slow time release fertilizers are always ideal, and you want to make sure when you apply them, usually in pellet form, you don't put them, like I mentioned earlier, right on the stem or on the trunk. You do it in the surrounding soils.
All right, as a reminder for those of you at home who don't have their copy of the SoCal Yard Transformation book, just want to let you all know that you can access this book on our website at eastvalley.org/conservation for your digital copy, or if you like a hard copy, please email conservation@eastvalley.org and let us know that you would like your own copy so we can mail that out to you. Again, this book has a lot of information from gardening tips to example watering schedules, so if you don't have one, we'd be happy to mail one to you. We've learned a lot of family-friendly gardening tips, and now we want to learn a little bit more tips that are more adult-oriented to help us keep our landscaping thriving.
Now we're going to be talking about irrigation. For those of you that are going to be doing edibles, especially in ground or on planterns, we highly recommend drip irrigation. There are many benefits to drip irrigation, and of course it's easy to install. It is low maintenance. It obviously reduces weeds. The water goes directly to the roots, and it allows the water to seep slowly into the plant itself. It reduces runoff, and it is more efficient way of watering. Now the question is, do I need to apply mulch? And the answer is, of course, going to vary. Let me explain to you what organic mulch is. It's a natural material, usually that breaks down over time, such as green bark or leaves, pine needles, etc. And the reason that you mulch is so that it reduces evaporation. Therefore, it's going to save plenty of water by doing that. And another thing it does is that it's going to feed the soil biology in decomposing and making that soil healthy. So it's a bonus. And of course, the question now is, how much do you apply? Normally you would apply about 3 inches. And 3 inches might seem like a significant amount. But the reality is that, of course, it is going to settle and it is going to be compacted, and it'll end up being about half of half of those 3 inches. So keep that in mind when you do install it. And a tip for you with that is that you never want to put any mulch on a stem or on a trunk. Doing so will obviously promote pests to be around either the stem or the trunk, and it may cause disease. And of course, it may also retain too much moisture, and it may actually rot it out. So be mindful of that and do not apply it particularly on the stem or on the trunk. You do apply it from spring through fall, and of course, it is beneficial to apply to ornamentals as well. As far as organic mulches, many people do not apply it to their edibles. And the reason being is because they are already applying a significant amount of composted material and amended soils to it. It's already conditioning the soil itself. So it's not necessary, but for those of you that choose to do so, please keep in mind that it's already got material that is going to decompose. Now we're going to talk about inorganic mulches, such as rock, lava rock, gravel, pebbles. Many people are aware that if you apply it as a mulch, as a top layer or a top dressing to your garden in the summer months, which in Southern California is traditionally more than 6 months out of the year, it does radiate heat. And unless your plants are either succulents or cacti, they will be stressed by the effect of that heat. So be very mindful of those material choices. Other choices that are considered for mulching are man-made, such as plastic sheeting and weed fabric or rubber mulches. And we're going to be talking about rubber mulch in just a minute, but those are choices that if you choose to make, you might want to put a little effort in investigating the benefits, because much research has been done and they have not shown any significant benefit to the garden itself. So be mindful of that. Another thing I want you to be mindful of and beware of are the freebies or the sales. Usually in spring, many of the box stores are going to have several bags of what they call mulch on sale. But if you take a very good look at some of those materials, you will find that they are not mulches, they are wood shavings. Now, those wood shavings are not going to decompose. They are not going to be beneficial to your soil. And another thing is that many times they really complicate for the gardener the ability to pull out weeds. And of course, they become a nuisance since they don't decompose to the plant itself. It may retain some moisture, but the benefit does not outweigh the disadvantages of installing it. Another one, of course, is going to be the rubber mulch. Do not apply it to your plants. Hot weather will raise the temperature even higher than some of those inorganic mulches like the rocks and the pebbles. And it has a very toxic smell to it that never seems to go away. Of course, they do recommend that you apply it because it's a one-time, lifetime application, but it does not benefit your soil. So keep that in mind and do not, on our recommendation, apply it. Another one, of course, is those mulch drop-off companies that many people are finding on the internet and obviously using. One thing that I have found is that these companies are really just using you or the customers as a dumping ground for their shredded materials. Many times what they are really delivering to you is a bunch of material that has gone through a shredder and is going to be dropped off potentially with contaminants from either a diseased tree or shrubs or bushes, and even contaminants that have weed seeds. A lot of times that's what you'll end up with, and because these companies do not ever disclose what kind of material exactly they'll be delivering to you, you may get stuck potentially with material that is not ever going to be a benefit to your landscape. So keep those things in mind. And those free manure signs that you might see at some of those locations, places that are in agriculture, be mindful that manure has not been solarized, meaning that you will find a lot of seed of weeds in it. And of course, because it's not properly solarized, that manure is going to burn your plants completely, like if you were to apply it directly. And of course, none of us want to do that. So sometimes those freebies and those sales are just not worth that kind of an effort for the disadvantages. Another thing, of course, we talked about bulk material, and I do recommend bulk material because you may find better prices on it. Keep in mind that when you do buy bulk material, you do need to know the length and the width and also the depth of what you plan to install. Knowing those numbers, of course, are going to benefit you when you request the amount of material that you're going to need. Many of the companies have charts and will tell you specifically how much of the material you will be required. So keep that in mind. Of course, they do deliver, some companies at some fees, and others can also do by doing a pickup. Okay, we're going to talk about weed control, but I want you to understand, how do they get there? We all wonder, because none of us obviously buy it or bring it intentionally home. But the fact is that there are 5 ways that it does make its way to your garden. And one of them is through wildlife. Birds, pests, pets, insects can carry seeds into your landscape. And of course, you have nature with winds, rain, and runoff that can also bring it into your garden. You have humans. We can carry it and transport it into our garden with our shoes, with our clothing, and of course, transplants, such as contaminated soils like we talked about earlier, or mulches or manures, even in plants that might carry a couple of weeds here and there, and of course, even transplanting or relocating rocks. Sometimes these rocks are not properly cleaned unless you purchase them, of course, but I would always recommend a good rinse before you install it, just to make sure that when water does hit that rock, it doesn't deliver any weed seeds into your landscape. And finally, the transfer. If you happen to have a gardener and you're starting to notice more weeds in your lawn, you might want to consider the fact that they are delivering with your mowing seeds. How does that happen? They might potentially be doing a cleanup at someone's home or in an area, and they might be obviously weeding an area. When they use their tools, they do not sanitize them, they do not rinse them or clean them. They load them into load them in and transport them, and then come to your home and start up their tools into your landscape. And of course, the minute the blade of that lawnmower starts, all the seeds that were in the previous residence or yard or location are now going to be introduced into your landscape. And not only does that happen with gardeners, but it happens within your own home. If you start off with a little section that may have had weeds and you mow it, well, you just blew those seeds into the rest of your landscape. So be mindful of that. My kids always used to know the routine before we started the mowing business of doing it at home. They always had to make sure that there weren't any weeds that were seeding so that they didn't spread. And I recommend that you keep that in mind as well. So now that we're talking about the weeds, we need to talk about the maintenance. And one thing I always say, a dear friend of mine always shared this with me. She said, see a weed, pull a weed, don't let it seed. And of course, that means that you're going to need to stay on top of things. A lot of times, the easiest way to start tackling a task is a little bit at a time. You can start off maybe sectioning an area and doing that, and maybe creating a calendar or a schedule to continue to do the rest of it. And that's probably the best and easiest way to do it. Now, when I weed myself, I always make sure that the soil is moist because it is easier to pull out the weed with the entire root itself. You're gonna struggle, especially if you're doing it with dry soil. So that's a little tip for you, for those of you that are gonna be doing some weeding in your landscape or in your home. Of course, you don't want to introduce anything that's going to contaminate it, and you want to, in your gardening maintenance, you want to be mindful of pest and disease. You obviously want to observe it and you want to treat it immediately, and you want to check for moisture at all times as well, because you want to avoid those soggy roots that plants will rot, and you also want to check for dry spots, and you want to make irrigation adjustments as necessary. So those are the things that you do with the maintenance. Of course, you also want to make sure that extreme weather is something that you keep up with. Whether it's frost or extreme heat, you want to use a cover or a shade for it to protect your plants. You also want to examine your edibles as they ripen, because one thing you want to do is remove it immediately to protect it from having pests eat them and beat you to it. Of course, one thing that you can do is use a maybe a recyclable water bottle, cut the bottom of it, and use the bottom of that bottle to secure a plant in it, and you take the cap off to make sure that you create a protection if you have snails or slugs or even other pests in your garden that might hinder your seedlings from maturing. So that's another tip for you. And of course, you want to stay on top of any pests, especially things such as rabbits or squirrels or even gophers. Be sure to eradicate them appropriately. We never recommend poisons. Of course, poisons can always secondarily kill other wildlife, and we don't want that, or even pets. So you want to make sure that you use things such as repellents or even a service if you feel like you're not up for that. So staying on top of those situations are always going to be beneficial. Now, the last thing I want to talk about, for those of you that are going to maintain just a nice ornamental garden, it's not going to get very fancy, it's just going to be the upkeep. And especially for those of you that are still going to keep your lawns, I I have some tips for you that are going to keep your lawn healthy. And one of them is to always mow your lawn at 2 inches. How do you do that? Well, you make sure that that lawnmower sits either on a driveway or a leveled area, and you raise the wheels to about 2 inches. That will ensure that you get a 2-inch cut on your lawn. It may seem taller than normal gardeners, or even you might potentially have, but the reason for it is that it will reduce evaporation, it will retain moisture, and it will limit the kind of weeds that grow in your lawn. Another thing that you want to do, especially now in the spring, is you want to dethatch your lawn. What is that? Well, I'm going to tell you. Basically, you're going to be raking your lawn, and you're going to be removing all the dead grass clippings that are sitting on it. And it's going to look terrible, maybe for a few days, but it's going to benefit the lawn in the long run, because it is going to ensure that water goes and penetrates deeply into the roots, and it doesn't just slide off into the gutters or the storm drains, as it may commonly do, especially if it's heavily compacted with dead clippings. And of course, it reduces disease, and overall it will improve the appearance of your lawn. Another thing you can do also in the spring is you can aerate your soil. Basically what you're going to be doing, if you have the tools, manual tools, you can pull out plugs of soil and lawn. And what it will do when you create these small holes is allow air and water and nutrients to penetrate into the grass roots. By doing that, you reduce the soil compaction. You also reduce water runoff and puddling, and allow the roots to grow deeper and healthier. And finally, I want to talk about fertilizers. You do not want to fertilize a dormant lawn, meaning a lawn that is warm season lawn. Cool weather in the winter and winter showers with night dew will sustain it just fine. So you want to make sure you always turn off that water, and of course you don't want to fertilize it. You want to give it the season to rest. But when you do fertilize it, make sure it is a slow organic fertilizer. And by doing that, the overall health of your lawn will sustain itself for the duration of the season. Now that concludes all the fundamental basics of gardening that most of you will need, especially those that are beginners, novice, and even those that are experienced, as a refresher. And the reason that we've done this is that you do want to have a successful garden. You do want to have an opportunity to share with your children the gained knowledge that you've just been shared. And of course, we want to recap what really a family-friendly garden is. And that is really cultivating and sharing garden knowledge and personalizing landscaping space, maybe with your children. You want to grow plants, you want to do crops, and maybe harvest with your children and your family. Of course, we want you to inspire them with creativity and motivation in the garden, teaching them about responsibility as well, and of course, making memories. But one thing I want you to keep in mind, that not everything is always going to turn out perfect. You're going to have some really great memories here and there, and you're going to have some epic fails, especially with children. And I want you to be mindful that when the planning does not reflect the envisioned result, don't despair. Time and maturity on your children's end will eventually resolve for that. Be patient with your children and expect the unexpected. They're kids. And remember, kids grow up fast. So enjoy them, and I hope you take advantage of an opportunity of having a family-friendly gardening experience with them. That concludes our program. Thank you again for joining us and for sharing with us all the information that we provided. We certainly hope you have a great experience, and we thank you again. Bye-bye.
Great. Thank you, Isabel. That was a very helpful and informative workshop. We hope all of you at home enjoyed it as well. For any questions on today's workshop, please submit your questions at info@iewaterkeeper.org. Again, if you have any questions on today's topic, submit your questions to info@iewaterkeeper.org. We want to thank you for joining us today at our workshop. And as a little added thank you, please like this video on Facebook for your chance to be entered into a raffle for some fun gardening prizes. All of our winners will be announced on Monday, so keep your eye out on Facebook, on our page, to see if you're one of our lucky winners. For more conservation information, visit eastvalley.org. Again, my name is Janet Robledo, and I want to thank you for joining us on our workshop, and we hope we see you soon. Thank you. Goodbye.